I'm going to follow the same format that the previous panel followed and ask each person to talk a little bit about who they are, what they're working on, and also, because we're supposed to be the Kumbaya Up With People panel, to talk about something in their world, in the criminal justice world that they inhabit, that's working, something that they see as a success. Shannan?
So I'm Shannan Reaze. I work with 9 to 5 Working Women of Georgia. We are a 43-year-old organization that's primarily been working on workplace issues for women. You might remember the Dolly Parton movie, 9 to 5. That is our organization. In 2011, we got into criminal justice reform issues around Ban the Box. We had a member of our organization who was experiencing employment discrimination because of her record. And she came to us, and like a good membership-based organization, we took up the cause, and we've been pushing on Ban the Box in Georgia. So far, we have 5 cities across the state of Georgia that we've been successful in passing Ban the Box or fair hiring policies, and we've also been able to get a Republican governor to issue an executive order to ban the box on all state jobs. What I would say is working best within that is our ability to do leadership development of directly impacted people to drive the campaign and the issues.
And how did you get the governor and those cities to go along with Ban the Box?
We took directly impacted leadership to all of the decision makers because the governor had created the Council for Criminal Justice Reform in the state. That actually enabled us to have a platform to be able to get that as a priority within his initiative. So him creating that initiative was first, and then our ability to just get into the room and get at the table, I think, and then using the voices of people who were experiencing the discrimination was just critical and key. And we didn't make it a Democrat-Republican issue. We really did just make this a human story issue that we were taking to decision makers.
I want to come back to the Democrat-Republican thing, but let's, Dan?
Hello, my name is Dan McGrath. I'm the Executive Director of Take Action Minnesota. Take Action Minnesota is a statewide people's network of organizations and individuals. And for us, we sort of put the premise of our organization is if we want to change who benefits in our economy, we have to change who decides in our democracy. And so that sort of analysis, leads us to look at our state, and just to paint a real quick picture, so Minnesota is healthier, wealthier, we're better educated than virtually any state in the country if you're a white person. And if you're a person of color, on average, you will be last or next to last compared to any other state. So those sort of vast disparities in our state are what necessarily led us to work on criminal justice reform and amongst other issues, and I can talk more about that. But for us, about 5 years ago now, we were also looking at a campaign on Ban the Box and looking to move a state policy when the political climate in our state shifted and made it next to impossible to actually move that issue forward, right? So our members and our leaders had named access to employment with having a criminal record as sort of the primary issue that we're facing. We couldn't move state policy, and so we shifted our focus to trying to move a major employer, in this case Target Corporation, which is a homegrown, much beloved, second largest retailer in the country, 4th largest employer in our state. We waged a campaign over a couple years to move them, and really, a lot of what Charlene said earlier about how you got to in this case, not only take on the task of trying to win something concrete, but actually take on the task of humanizing people with criminal records so that you can actually move larger policy. I'm happy to say more, but I'll say that through a set of protests, legal action, filing 10 EEOC complaints after a hiring action where we had 150 people with records apply to work at Target at the peak of the holiday season and none get offered a job, that paved the way to a set of EEOC complaints. To make a long story short, that got Target to the table. Not only were we able to move Target Corporation to ban the box nationwide, which was a great feat, but I think what's maybe more important is in that intervening time, the political climate shifted. And we had Ban the Box moving at the state legislature, and Target became instrumental in moving the business community to drop its opposition to that bill and actually pass the state policy as well. So.
Just to follow up, do you know what the impact has been on Target's actual hiring of formerly incarcerated people?
You know, we don't yet, only because it's still early on and we don't have the data back, but we continue to be at the table with targets. So that's actually one of the key points that we continue to raise, is what are actually the metrics on their progress. So we're looking for it. We don't have the answer yet.
Danielle.
I am Danielle Sarad, and I direct Common Justice, which is a demonstration project of the Vera Institute. And as we sort of heard in the first panel, we know that we cannot reduce mass incarceration to levels that are anywhere near, for example, what they were when I was born, without tackling the question of violence. So we have a lot of conversations about nonviolent offenses and what people call low-hanging fruit. But we know to see transformative change in this country, we'll have to think about handling violence differently. And it's our belief that we can only do that if we can demonstrate that something other than incarceration is possible, not only at keeping the public safe, but at meeting the needs of the people who are harmed by crime. So when we asked ourselves what would it look like to create a criminal justice system in which the greatest portion of victims experience justice and safety when they decide to engage law enforcement, we came to what in this context seems like a counterintuitive conclusion, which was that we needed to build more alternatives to incarceration. We understood that incarceration fails to deliver people and communities the safety, the healing, the security, the information that they richly deserve when they've suffered the kind of harm none of us want to suffer. And that when the criminal justice system provides those victims with more options, we are more likely to satisfy their basic fundamental needs. In a country where half of victims of violence don't even decide to report that crime, we should be faced with a sense of enormous moral urgency, that what we have on the table for people who are hurt is so vastly inconsistent with their needs for safety and justice that they would prefer nothing to the one blunt instrument we have available. And so we tried to develop another instrument. So we run a restorative justice-based alternative to incarceration for serious and violent felonies. We run it in partnership with the district attorney's office. Our numbers are still very small, so they should not impress researchers in the room. But for the rest of you, I will say that only 5 of our 54 responsible parties, which is what we call defendants who have been through the program, have been terminated for new crimes. Since we went through a revamping of our process in 2012, only 1 person who's entered since then has been terminated for a new crime. So while nothing is yet statistically significant, we are deeply persuaded that we are doing something that has enormous potential to have transformative impact. The one other way we're unique, in addition to being the only alternative to incarceration in this country to focus on violence, is in our realism about who victims of crime are. So we know young men of color are 10.5 times more likely than I am to be robbed or assaulted, but still vastly underrepresented in victim services. And so we are in leadership in a national charge to elevate the urgency of addressing the needs of the full range of victims of crime, and understand that as a key dimension of the racial and economic inequities that we've all been talking about here today.
Thank you. Ron?
Good afternoon. My name is Ron Simpson-Bey. I'm a leader in the JustLeadershipUSA collective through Mr. Glenn Martin in New York. We strive to come to the table representing those who have been formerly incarcerated, because we think that you have to have someone at the table that has been formerly incarcerated if you can have a discussion on mass incarceration. Because to have that discussion without the formerly incarcerated at the table is like discussing women's reproductive rights without having women at the table.
That's right.
So we come to expand the discussion and to help facilitate it. I also work for an organization called American Friends Service Committee out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. We have a criminal justice unit. And it's interesting working for the Quakers because they're an international peace initiative social justice organization who are responsible for bringing prison and solitary confinement as we know in America. And they're at the forefront of abolishing it now. So these are real heady times. I look out among this crowd and I'm encouraged because I think of a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King where he says, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We in that period of bending toward justice, restorative justice, healing justice, social justice. Everything is about justice and everyone is talking about it, not just one side or the other. So at American Friends, I run a project called the Good Neighbor Project. And what we seek to do is we have a co-mentorship program based on restorative justice principles between those serving life and long indeterminate sentences in Michigan and the community. And the purpose is to change the dialogue and discussion on crime and punishment and to also give some support to those who are least supported inside the prison, but they're the best behaved segment of the population. And because if we don't change that discussion, then all these measures are just temporary. Until the next legislative sessions come around, they vote them out of order. We have to have hard change. You have that community hard change. So we creating a space to have the community hard change. And one of the ways we do that through this co-mentoring project is we develop a curriculum. So it's not just a feel good, you writing about, what your cat and dog doing. We're writing about teaching empathy, self-reflection, and the things that make the formerly incarcerated good neighbors, so to speak. And also in Michigan, I was listening to the ban the box. We weren't able to pass ban the box. We've been trying to pass it for years. I'm not sure why, but they recently passed a set of bills to allow for the Department of Corrections to issue what's called a certificate of employability to those who get out, which I think is better than ban the box, because not only does it's certified that the person returning to our community is now qualified to work, but the second part of that bill, it absolves the hirer, the employer, of any liability connected with hiring that person. So they can use that certificate to show what we had due diligence in hiring this person. So these, like I said, these are very, very heady times, and I appreciate being here.
We heard a lot from the previous panel, and everybody's read about the sort of strange bedfellows alliance of Republicans and Democrats. You have Rand Paul and Cory Booker co-sponsoring bills. You have John Wetzel and Mark Levin sitting, side by side on a panel discussion. That's at the national level. We have here Minnesota, New York, Michigan, and Georgia represented. What's the situation in your states on this issue in terms of bipartisanship?
Michigan, in the current legislation, there's still a lot of bipartisan. There's still a lot of separatism and bipartisan. But in the community, there's a growing vast number of a coalition that I'm a part of in Michigan to end mass incarceration. And the stakeholders that have come to this coalition, the organizations are on both sides of the issue. We have former Republican legislators and Democratic legislators who are sitting on the same panel. Former heads of the Department of Corrections and their deputy sitting with community people, churches and pastors. So the coalition itself is diverse. It's very bipartisan, even though the legislature itself is still somewhat divided. But there is hope. Monday, Governor Snyder gave a speech in Michigan dealing with his vision for ending mass incarceration. So, and he gave a lot of very promising remarks.
Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to chime in there. So in Georgia, primarily, if you want to get anything done, it must be done with Republican leadership.
Yeah, Republican governor.
Republican governor, Republican legislator. And while we began this campaign in Atlanta, which is clearly a democratically held city, it took the fact that the governor, so many people may not know, part of Governor Deal's interest within criminal justice reform is that his son is a drug court judge. So this is a family conversation. Part of his interest in this is that everyone that works at the governor's mansion is actually an incarcerated person. So he's having direct contact, and it has been through his direct interactions with the people who work in the governor's mansion that have made him take up this issue. It is the conversations with his son, Jason Deal, who is a judge, that have made these personal issues for him. Everyone talks about when the governor swears them in and he provides a plaque. He tells the story, if you're a judge getting sworn into the state of Georgia, he tells a story about the fact that the plaque is actually made by prison labor. So the ways that we personalize and really connect these things into the decision makers, really understand those levers and triggers, I think are absolutely critical for how we bring these things to the primary issue that our decision makers are going to take up. What we had to do, because these issues of criminal justice reform tend to be very democratic issues, is go to our democratic leaders and ask for them to actually sit back, for them to actually be in support. And we got a lot of pushback about, oh, you're going to give the Republicans more votes, more credibility, more power.
They're going to get Willie Horton.
And, we really just had to be on the efficacy of winning, that the time is now. Is that we can't wait for Georgia to become a democratic state, which may happen soon and very soon, considering the changing demographics of our population. But it's not happening now. So we have to be able to, no matter what, as trained organizers, as trained grassroots organizers, community organizers, we take the issue to power no matter who holds the power. And that was the principle that we had to really lean into deeply, to be able to have that conversation from all the different angles that they wanted to have it. We didn't change up the story of our people. We didn't change up the experience of our people to be in these Republican spaces, but we knew that those were the venues that we had to go to. And once that leadership was like clear and leading, we were able to move Democratic leadership to just get behind it and support and not get in the way. Which sometimes, unfortunately, when we get into these things, the Democrats want to buck because they want the credit. And that's some hard, deep conversations that we had to have with our Democratic leadership around it. And then you see it moving around the state, that while we moved it in Atlanta, then we moved to Fulton, we moved to East Point, that's all in the Atlanta metro area. When we started moving the conversation in places like Macon, in places like Albany, in places like Savannah and Columbus, as we're in those meetings with those Republicans, they're hitting the phone. Because they're like, no, Republicans aren't doing this. Republicans aren't for this issue. And then when they get on the phone with the governor and he's actually saying, yeah, no, I'm going to do it, then they felt an impetus to be able to do it. So that's kind of how we really just had to remove the partisan conversation and just ask everybody to play their part. Like, be the leader that you can be in this moment.
Can I jump in?
Sure, of course.
So in Minnesota, we now sort of have a 5-year arc to look at. So in 2010, Republicans took control of the legislature, and we knew at that point, it was communicated pretty clearly, that ban the box was not going to go anywhere. So that's what prompted a change in strategy to work with and try to move Target Corporation. So we had sort of strong we had strong interest from some Democrats in this issue. I think it's important to note that that is not the same thing as willingness to fight for the fight, right? But at that time, that was the hand we were dealt, and I think it was good strategy and good fortune, to look outside of the Capitol and look for a way to create a larger public conversation about, what in our state, we at the time had the worst racial jobs gap in the country, right? And so a conversation with Target Corporation, which was eventually boiled down to, look, either you are widening that gap or you are narrowing that gap, but you got to pick a side. You already have picked a side, in fact. Well, to fast forward, when Democrats retook control of the legislature in 2012, there was much more momentum behind ban the box. That was a good thing. But the State Chamber of Commerce made it a very top priority to stop that legislation from happening. And so important to understand that it's not just a question of bipartisanship, it is a question of where do major interests align around these issues. And in that instance, having the chamber against it stopped the Democrats from being able to move it. And not until we were able to move Target and Target was able to move the chamber were things unlocked. So important to say that, like, just having Democrats on your side ain't going to get it done. Well, what's very interesting is this last session, we've been moving a bill to restore the right to vote for people on probation and parole. We have a relatively small incarcerated population. We have a very large population who are on supervised release. We had 30 Republicans in both chambers supporting this legislation. And we were like, this is going to get done. This is going to be great. And our session wrapped up on Monday, and it didn't get done. And so we're all smarting a bit from this, but the lesson we take away is, even with strong bipartisan support, and that is strong bipartisan support, we still faced Republican leadership who felt they were politically at risk with their own primary voters had Restore the Vote passed. And so what eventually ended it was the Speaker of the House just simply not allowing it to go forward. So it tells us something, that there is actually some emergence of rank and file Republican members in the state legislature who are more open to these issues, and there is a countervailing force, which is perhaps more establishment Republicans who are still concerned about where their base is at.
In some ways in New York, the most bipartisan thing we've seen around criminal justice is that both the Democratic leader of the Assembly and the Republican leader of the Senate have been arrested in the last couple months. So there's some movement in that direction. I think one of the ways this pattern plays out in New York is about the urban and rural divide, which maps onto a racial divide, which is connected to the economic needs of upstate counties. And we heard some talk about this in the previous panel. But there are many counties that are former industrial towns where you sort of pass the rundown factory thinking you're at the prison, and then 400 feet later you're at where the prison really is. And it's the same employees who were in that factory, it's the same families who were employed in that factory a generation earlier. And so there are real deep economic interests that aren't just kind of profiteering ones, but people who put dinner on the table for their families and pay their rent exclusively because that prison exists, whether they work in it, whether they work in the company that does laundry services that provide food for it. And so the deep dependence of upstate towns on prisons to meet their basic needs, because these are not people who are becoming wealthy off of prisons. They're people who are making ends meet in a town where there is no other industry and no other work. That the resolution of that problem, which is an economic problem, not just a social problem, is a really crucial piece to developing the kind of significant movement in New York we would otherwise see. That said, even when we recognize it, we know that Black and brown people's freedom can't be a job program for middle class folks upstate. Like we can't continue to do that because it's morally wrong. But until there's an economic solution, it's very hard to expect the elected officials from a jurisdiction where that is the only source of most families' income to be active participants in eliminating those jobs.
So just listening to what you've said, and our assignment is to point the way to some pathways to success. One of them is clearly personal contact, worked with the governor. One of them is leverage. If you can file enough lawsuits against Target, you'll get them to the negotiating table. What other tactical recommendations would you have for somebody who's trying to set off to fix something in the criminal justice system?
I would say the meaningful change is going to come at the grassroots level. I mean, every social justice reform in our country and history has really been effective from the grassroots up. And the project which we run through American Friends Service, we seek to change that discussion in the grassroots. Because if you don't change that dynamic, like I said earlier, it's not really not going to be sustainable. But if you reach the people that are incarcerated, we're talking about ending mass incarceration. And in Just Leadership USA, we're talking about cutting it in half by 2030. But the problem with that is, you think back to when they freed the slaves. When after the euphoria of slavery wore off, they walked back to the plantations because they hadn't been prepared. Mm-hmm. So these co-membership projects that we're running and the interaction which he just spoke about between those incarcerated and the free society, it helps give those incarcerated a feeling of being stakeholders in their community. Mm-hmm. And then now that brings value. It makes our community safer because now they got vested interest in keeping it safer. And so in turn, you have the heart change in the community to support these provisions and these reforms, which we seek to enact on the policy level.
And I want to just pick up right behind that like we're in this room having this conversation because formerly incarcerated people began meeting 20 and 25 years ago to force this conversation into our society. As we come to these solutions, it is absolutely imperative that that's who leads. That what we're most proud of in the work that we've done in Georgia is that in every city that we work in, it is people who were experiencing the employment discrimination that led this effort. I consider myself a facilitator in the process. My job is to bring those powerhouses together to make sure that they have the resources necessary to lead on the solutions for their lives. And as we sit in the Beltway, it is critical and important that no decision-making table is absent of people who have lived the problem. That if you have decision-making tables that do not include people who have actually lived the problem, you're probably not going to get to the right solution. That if you want the solution, you got to go ask somebody that lived the entire problem. And being serious about what that human and personal leadership development work is that we have to do with these populations for them to hold these Beltway level tables, right? So like I can hold these conversations in community in a town hall forum. They're going to say it in particular ways that I might bring them into the Beltway and folks get a little uncomfortable with how they're going to articulate their experience. But that's our job as organizers. That's our job as institutions that are getting behind this, is to make sure that our people are prepared to lead.
That's right.
I think there's another constituency in this country who have enormous moral authority, to whom law enforcement is connected and at least purportedly accountable. and who have an enormous interest in the end of mass incarceration, and that's victims of crime. We hear from a tiny sliver of crime victims, right? Fewer than 2% of robbery victims get help when they've been hurt. So when we say victims want, victims know, victims like, I don't have to work at the Vera Institute of Justice to tell you that 2% is a totally pathetic sample size. And it's not randomly selected, right? Who gets to law enforcement support, whose cases are taken seriously, who's referred to services, for whom those services meet their needs, right? Those aren't arbitrary narrowing factors, and everyone in the room knows exactly what those are. What we've learned at Common Justice, and remember our numbers are small, but when we ask, we only take cases into the program if the victim of those crimes agree. So people who have suffered really serious violence are given the choice about whether the person who hurt them is incarcerated or comes to us. 90% of the victims we talk to choose incarceration. I mean, choose Common Justice over incarceration. 90% choose this. So what that tells us, it tells us something about our own practice, but it also, these are people who called the police and went to grand jury, right? So these are of victims. This is the jailingest subset you're going to find. And even within that group, we see 90% of people who want something different. And so what that teaches us is that when you ask somebody whether they want something with no alternatives on the table, it is not a predictor of what they will want when something else is also available.
Is the problem just that the victims who want a punitive response are better organized?
I think that's part of it. I also think their voices are elevated, right? So we have told a story in this country for a very long time that a victim is someone who looks like me. It's the formative myth of our country. I have been the victim of serious crime. It is not that I can't be hurt. But when I was hurt, there were services for me everywhere. So when I survived sexual assault in my teens as a white woman, there were rape crisis centers, there were programs, there were hotlines everywhere for me. I didn't actually avail myself of any of those services, but the fact that they existed conveyed to me that what happened to me was wrong, that my pain mattered, that my society cared about my pain and was willing to do what a society does about something it takes seriously, which is to put resources behind it. And in that, those things not only provided an anchor for my healing, but gave me moral authority so that when I said, this is what I want to see out of a criminal justice process, my opinion was regarded as legitimate. And so I think it does require organizing, better organizing of victims who want something other than what's available. But so much of the organizing that has happened through the channels of existing victim services, which are constrained by the same misconceptions and racial biases that constrain everything that we're talking about on the defendant side.
That's right. Can I add something to that?
Sure.
The flip side of the victimization coin, in 2001 on Father's Day, my 21-year-old son was shot and killed by a 14-year-old juvenile. And I advocated for this juvenile not to go through the adult system to be treated as a juvenile, adjudicated as a juvenile. However, I got pushback from the prosecutor's office. They did not want to support that. I had to write letters to the court. I had to do a lot of advocating on my own because there were no support services for victims such as myself who didn't want the offender to be treated harshly as an adult. So there is a lot in our system that fosters this type of dichotomy. The victims that have been, like say, that look like her and who have voices against those who don't have voices.
Yeah. And I do think what it speaks to is your question was about tactics, and I actually think it's, in some respects, our problem is we don't tend to respond very strategically, right? Like we do respond tactically. And just to underscore and everything that Shannan said and then some, I couldn't agree more. We often say around our shop, how we win is just as important as what we win.
That's right.
Because nothing we are going to win today is going to solve all of our problems, right? So we've got to think about, and so there's sort of three pieces, right? We think about, well, what is concrete and meaningful change that we can win, right? But also, what in the process of that work are we going to build that's going to endure, right? That's leadership, that's alliances, those are coalitions. And how are we going to change the larger story? Because even if what we are fighting for today is defined by what is considered possible, and until we expand what is understood to be politically possible, nothing changes. And that fundamentally is driven by the people who are directly impacted, right? That is the whole premise, right? Like the people who lead these fights are the people who are the people best qualified to lead these fights are the ones who have the direct experience of it, and therefore are the ones who have to be at the table and driving the strategy not just showing up and speaking, but driving the strategy and the decisions and the policy that's actually...
That they be the experts.
You got it.
That the
That's
experts
right.
are actually the impacted voices. One more thing I just want to add to the explicitness of our conversation. We've kind of danced around it a little bit, but we just have to be fundamentally clear that the criminal justice system is a racist system.
Absolutely.
That this system is built on maintaining control and oppression of black and brown bodies, first being black bodies moving out of enslavement and into chain gangs and into, you know, creating this criminal justice system. That incarceration is rooted in racism. And if we are not addressing racism in a fundamental way within any of our solutions, we're not going to end this issue. That if you're not centering your conversation on how race, and because I am with the women's organization, we have to be clear about the gender dynamics within this issue right now as well. That we're seeing a 646% increase in women's incarceration between 1980 and 2010. That there were 15,000 women incarcerated in prison in 1980, where now we're over 100,000 women. Like, we really have to understand the genderized impact upon that type of increase of incarceration. And then in addition to that, when you talk about black communities, where 1 in 3 black men are going to go through this process, those men have children, those men have families that have to be supported, and that burden then tends to fall back upon black women. That the issue of policing coming out of slave catching in reality, right? That slave catching mentality is still what is 100% prevalent within these zip codes and communities that we know are being deeply impacted by this. Do we want to continue to be a slave catching country? Because that's still what we're doing.
How exactly do you address that as part of a movement for change, though? Without alienating people who are, you know, going to take offense at being accused of racism? People who, to make incremental progress, you might need as short-term allies.
Most definitely coming out of Georgia, you know, I do not run into the state capitol saying,
Slave master.
as much as you want to. That's not the conversation that we have there. I think that there's tiers of the conversation. I think that on the state capitol level, being in a clarity in our organizing that the re-entry process is an attempt to reinvent the system. That's what we have seen, that every 50 years criminalization is reinvented in this country in a particular way to continue the slave catching. And when we go in to sit and talk about what are the new re-entry programs, we are deliberately thinking about what program is going to actually be effective in our communities with the populations that we know we care about. So we're really just bringing the solutions that we know are necessary for our community. I don't always name the race impact, but in a body in a space like this, I think it is critical as we're creating the solutions, creating the new rooms and spaces, that we're all rooted and grounded in that reality, that we are still trying to eliminate ourselves as a slave nation. That's what mass incarceration has become. It's a continuation of that institution in our country.
And can I add, I mean, like, so in Minnesota, 18% of the population is people of color, right? So we have to organize white people. So part of the work is moving white people along a spectrum, and it has to be. I think there's this bizarre paradox as we as white people think about race. We tend to sit back and think, well, we're just waiting for a person of color to kind of lead us out of this, when in fact, like, it is white people who are racist. So it is on white people to also, like, get it together and figure it out. And part of that is about how the work is done. Part of that is understanding, like, who is leading and being race explicit in the work itself. Just naming throughout the course. Because again, like, if you're taking the long view, then where is race present in this? Why are we fighting this fight? Who is being impacted and why? And look, it's a long and slow process, but the only way we get to amass the power that is required to make any change is by finding ways to build multiracial spaces, and also recognizing that there needs to be space and leadership from people directly impacted. By that I mean people of color, right? In the criminal justice system in Minnesota is African American men and Native American men who are principally impacted by it. And at the same time, expecting and demanding that white people and white allies, and also white people who are impacted by the system, step forward and be a part of that as well.
I want to pick up on something that Danielle touched on earlier. The last time I was in Washington on a panel discussion was a couple months ago when there was the big Bipartisan summit on criminal justice. And it was a very kind of kumbaya event, except for with one exception. Cory Booker took a moment to say, now I want you all to step out of your comfort zone for a minute, because everybody's talking about how we got to get the low-level drug offenders out of incarceration, and the low-level nonviolent property offenders. We don't need shoplifters to put shoplifters in Attica. But you can't get to 50% if that's your goal, or even 30% really, just by letting out the low-level offenders, not in the state systems. Nobody likes to talk about that very much. But the fact is, a serious end to mass incarceration, however ambitious your target is, means that some very scary people are likely to be released from prison. First of all, how do you sell that to the grassroots whose support you need to bring reforms?
So I do like to talk about that. As anyone who knows me, I can attest, I probably like to talk about it too much. So one of the things that we have to understand is the failure of incarceration to deliver on what it promises. Yeah. Right? So when I said 90% of victims of crime choose common justice over, it's not because 90% of people are like, I believe he has a beautiful heart and I want to be part of that transformation. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I would say that's 20%. Right. So what's that other 70% of people are people who know that and this is the sort of same, the kind of bright side of mass incarceration is that everybody knows more about it now, right? Is people who in their own experience, like one person I was talking to said, can the person get life without parole for this first degree robbery? And I said, like in Louisiana, but not here. And he said, well, then let's do common justice, right? Because his judgment was that if this person was ever going to be free again, he wanted that person to be different. Right? We had the mother of a 14-year-old son who was terribly beaten, who said, when that young man, she didn't use the word young man, but I won't use the word she did. When that young man first did this to my child, first I wanted him to drown to death, and then I wanted him to burn to death, and then I wanted him to drown in a river of fire for what he did to my child. But I have a 9-year-old boy who 3 years from today will be 12, and one of those days and this young man was facing 3 years on the Rob 1, and one of those days he's going to walk past this young man, because by then he's going to be going to and from the corner store and to and from his aunt's house and to and from school alone. And I have to ask myself, do I want that young man on that day to have been upstate, or do I want him to have been with y'all? And she said, well, if I had my machete with me today, not a machete, my machete, I would chop him to bits. It's like a really important distinction. I would chop him to bits, bury him under my house, and sleep soundly for the first night since he dared lay hands on my baby. The truth is, I'd rather him be with y'all. So what she was able to do is to put aside an individualized desire for revenge and make a judgment about what would advance the security of her child and children like him. Now, if a furious mother who has watched her own child come home in terrible physical and emotional pain can make a rational decision in the interest of public safety, surely all the lawyers in charge should be able to do something similar.
Although it sounds like that mother would have gone for life without parole.
She might have. She also might have gotten life without parole had we not kind of managed the separation. But I think what we know is that what we have to stop, I think the biggest change in the conversation about mass incarceration in this country is honestly not all, because the 94 bill was bipartisan. Like, we sort of give Democrats a little too much credit to pretend that this hasn't been bipartisan. So we've had bipartisan consensus around locking people up. It's pointed in a different direction, but I think the biggest change is that there is a public recognition that prison doesn't do what we ask it to do. And that for so long we thought it delivered safety, it delivered healing, it delivered transformation, right? It delivered people who wouldn't hurt people again, it made victims feel better. And when it did that, we were willing to do it at any cost, human or financial. And I think there's an increasing awareness that we are not getting a decent return on our investment. And in my view, that is all the more urgent in cases of violence. It is all the more important that we do something that works, because when we fail in cases of violence, what happens is other people get very seriously hurt. And so I think in a context where the public trust in incarceration is dirt low in communities deeply impacted by it, and lower than it's been in my lifetime in the national conversation, that it begins to open us up to a conversation that is about returning to the question of like, what do we do this for, right? Like, why are we doing this? What are we supposed to get out of it? And are we getting it? And if it doesn't deliver it, what might? And I think that that can open up a space for a different kind of debate that far more people than we anticipate will be able to find themselves in.
I mean, I think I read enough that I know that the science supports what you say. I'm not sure the politics does. I mean, I read a lot of people on the left and right who are coming out as reformers or evolving as reformers. And it always begins, we're not talking about violent offenders or sex offenders. Those are the sort of, sex offenders are untouchable class in this society, and violent offenders come pretty close. And I have to say, when Cory Booker invited people to get out of their comfort zone, nobody wanted to join him, and that was a crowd of enthusiastic reformers.
But I mean, Vera, the distinction between our work and some of the other work on this panel is that we don't run campaigns. We talk about what's true, right? And so in the moment before it is like politic to say we have to talk about violence, like we can say, based on the evidence, based on what we know, based on the very basic math, coupled with a belief in justice, that we have to steer into this conversation in a different way. And we have room to do it as people who don't have to have 51% of people in agreement with us at the end of that same day.
The issue of sex offenders and violent crime always comes up in a ban-the-box conversation. Any municipality you sit down with, it's the first thing that we always have to address. And we consistently combat it with, they have to eat, they have to have housing, they have to support their families. So no matter what they did, if they are returning home, we need to be able to find them employment in some industry, in some place in our society, or we are sending people back to jail, and we are going to continue to see crime repeating itself over and over again. So we are trying to address those issues, even within a ban-the-box that is a more palpable place, because it is a palpable place for you to have that conversation. And when I say we have to address that, not just with municipalities, but even in our town halls, even in our community conversations, it's always this, well, what are we gonna do about sex offenders? And I constantly have to remind people that most people who commit sexual offenses are not actually in the system. That if we're talking about addressing sexual violence in our community, it is not through a ban-the-box. It is not through criminal justice reform. That addressing sexual violence is a whole other section and category of our society that we have to deal with. So I think that we've got to continue to let folks know that, like, be clear about those separations and where we get the addressing of these issues in society.
If
I suppose I should say this is where the Marshall Project comes in, but that would be advertising.
Self-plug.
I'm sorry.
I'm listening. The reason it's such a cringe factor when you mention, sex offenders and murders and the more violent, so-called violent offenses, it's a residual holdover from these 30 years of, fear mongering. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. If you say certain things, you're gonna get certain reactions. And so it's to address the issue as a tactical matter, you have to go more on a more baser level. I always, recently, my director, in her brilliance, implemented a part about white privilege in this training session that I do. And because white privilege, like the elephant in the room, it's ubiquitous and it's all consuming, but no one really, reflects on it. And because of that, it affects every decision-making process, by the politicians and by the policy makers and those that's being affected by the policy. And I always laugh because I did a research on white privilege, and I went on my computer, I found all these studies and researches and Wikipedia stuff about, white privilege. And so I said, well, let me find out about black privilege. I typed it in my computer, and my computer locked up.
We've got maybe 10, 15 minutes left, so we've got time to take some questions from the floor if anybody has any.
Can we get at this, that while I make sure that we understand the criminal justice system as a racist system, fundamentally rooted in the racism that our country was built on, I really have to also just remind us that 1 in 3 Georgians has a criminal record.
That's right.
We are, 16% of the population in Georgia, that like 1 in 3 Georgians, that like while we want to say that this is a black issue in this particular way, white folks really got to come to grips with the fact that you are deeply impacted by this criminal justice system.
Deeply.
And that if you're not at the table for us to actually move and shift this, we're not going to get the shifting and the moving that we need. That like white folks who are being impacted by criminal justice, it is time for your leadership to step up and be clear about the fact that they are profiteering off of your backs, your body as well. That this isn't just a profiteering off of black bodies. This is profiteering off of poor people.
Absolutely.
Across the board.
That's right. And that is an actual opportunity to build power.
And that's why we go into the smaller, there was 159 counties in Georgia. Crazy, right? There's a long history about why we have 159 counties. But in those 159 counties, we are looking to organize the more predominantly white communities and counties. We just so happen to didn't have to get too deep into them in order to get the governor to do this. But if we want state legislation in a full way, that's the only way we're going to fully get it, is that we are not organizing purely on race, that we are organizing on impact.
Yep. That's right.
I had a hand up.
My name's Perry Georgis. I'm a documentary filmmaker on this issue and really highlighting successful reentry. And in my travels and research, and also having been formerly incarcerated and been out decades, what do you think? I've been really struck lately with the way our consumption as a society for films about and TV shows that have prison and crime. I mean, it's just, there's such a huge appetite for that. And almost a glossed overness of people who, the redemption stories and second chances. And I'm wondering if you guys had any thoughts about how media can change that conversation. I'm attempting to do with my film. There's other films out there now that are, and shows like Orange is the New Black has certainly created a conversation. And just media as well as entertainment consumption of this issue. Any thoughts?
Anybody want to take that up?
I mean, I can just speak to that quickly and say that, you know, when we first began working on criminal justice issues, right, and the reason we do this is we have a base of members and leaders with criminal records as well as victims who basically named, you know, this is the structural barrier we face, we want to tackle it together, what are we going to do? The first project we took on was just writing the story of how we are perceived by the public at large. What is the story that is said about us? And then we wrote a story about what is the story that we know to be true. And to distill it all down, which is not to do it the justice it deserves, is that there is, we have humanity. And I think what gets lost in all of the media around all of these issues is that there's almost a complete absence of humanity when you examine the question of criminal justice. So then when you walk into a state legislature with that same group of people, African American men primarily, it is palpable, the sense of unease amongst people who work inside the dome with those people. So it's a profound barrier. So I appreciate your question, what you're saying, and I'm saying that I think just beginning to restore the sense of humanity for people who have made a mistake, which by the way is all of us, but to restore that sense of humanity is the most fundamental thing that needs to happen. Otherwise, nothing that we're talking about ever becomes, possible.
In short, media is absolutely the driving force in this. I mean, because our consumption of social media and television media and all types of media, this is what drives us. It's not back in the day where all you did was read books. You know, you mentioned Orange is the New Black. I mean, I'm part of the old black, and I can tell you that we need the media. It really, is the driving force, because they can put a spin on anything. If you, look at all the, and back in the day, like somebody mentioned earlier on the previous panel, that back in 1965, gay rights, there was no such thing as gay rights. It was taboo to even talk about it. It was criminalized. But the more the media put it out there and talked about it in a certain way, it became more and more acceptable. It became more and more acceptable. And with any type of change, sustained change, it's going to take that same thing on the mass incarceration issue, on a basic level, to get away from glorifying the negative aspects of incarceration.
as the token media guy on the panel, it strikes me, and we talk about this a lot at the Marshall Project, that that we've been part of the problem for a long time. And not everybody, but the local TV news, if it bleeds, it leads. Crime stuff, which amps up the level of anxiety, and advertisers like it, I guess. During the period of the crack panic, if you go back and look at some of the TV footage, I mean, serious TV footage, the nightly news, the Walter Cronkite coverage, it had a ring of, the sky is falling, this new potent drug is creating super predators in the streets.
Exactly.
And the media added to the hysteria. And I think, at least some parts of the media have tried to be part of the solution now, and you're seeing there's some hint of contrition, I think, in the amount of coverage that criminal justice reform is starting to get, at least in the serious press.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of because in organizing we're always focusing on our message, right? Like, how do we message, how do we talk about this thing? And one thing that we've come through with the help of CCC and other great resources, that we've really got to emphasize what you said, the humanity of people, that this is about families, that as soon as we start talking about families and the separation of families, people start listening differently. We stop using words like ex-con. We have to, if the word that you use to describe or tell the story doesn't fully humanize that person, you're not contributing to the solution. That's what I would say to any media outlet, that if you're going to use ex-con, if you're going to use inmate, like all of these terms, offender, they dehumanize. And the reality is, I work with human beings. I work with mothers. I work with fathers. I work with sons. I work with daughters. I work with real people. And I have to make sure I convey that. And in all of our language and literature, that's how we talk about it. We talk about people and the real experience of families.
And I think the flip side of the sort of formative national narrative that all victims look like me is the story that all men of color are only dangerous and never endangered, right? That men of color can't feel, that men of color feel less pain somehow, even when they're subjected to the same thing. That if they're hurt, they probably brought it on themselves. Charlene, you talked earlier about Law and Order, and if you look at the old school, not all the like spin-off Law and Order is out, but Jerry Orbach, Benjamin Bratt doing their law thing. There is one episode where the victim is a young man of color, and it's this sort of silly story of a kid from the East Harlem who's up to no good on the Upper East Side, and gets killed in the orchestra room in his private school where he's on scholarship, which is not how most young men of color die. And this is a story, Law and Order is a story about homicide in New York City, where 98% of victims are people of color, the vast majority of those men. Right? And so the story we tell about who can be hurt is part of it too. Anytime there is a story about a young man of color who was killed that's more than 3 lines, by the time you get to 4 lines, one of them is about whether he had a criminal record.
Absolutely.
Right? So there's it says, and he had never been arrested. And we're like, oh God, we lost one of the good ones. Right? Or they say, and he had been arrested 5 times.
Like, ooh, got
right? Which is not actually justification to take someone's life. Right? The fact that someone has been arrested 5 times.
Exactly.
Even though most of those 5 times were probably for marijuana possession, it was New York City, but still, right? Like, we cannot tell the story of men of color without invoking a story about their criminality. And at some point, we have to be able to tell a story that recognizes the reality that, like all of us, men of color can be vulnerable, can be afraid, can be hurt, can experience pain. In all the conversations about Mike Brown, in Ferguson, and everyone was like, was he the aggressor? Was he not the aggressor? Was he this? No one was like, my God, that boy must have been scared. Right? Like in the 500,000 blog posts and everything that you all read about it, no one said, not one I read, said, that boy must have been scared in those last moments faced with that gun. That 18-year-old boy must have been scared out of his mind. And maybe he was also angry, maybe he was also anything else, but I bet my life he was scared.
No doubt.
How could you not be as a human being faced with a gun? Right? And so we've erased the reality of particularly black men's vulnerability, men generally, black men particularly in this country, and we have to learn how to retell that story, because we will only be able to see people in their full humanity if we know they're not only capable of things of beauty, things of great hope, things of generosity, but also capable of things like fear and pain and struggle like everybody else.
That's great.
Yeah.
My name is Chris Poulos, and I served a multiple-year federal prison sentence myself during my early 20s for a first-time nonviolent drug offense, which is all the rage right now, that first-time nonviolent drug offense. But that's my story. I spent years behind a wall because of a first-time nonviolent drug offense, and I think it's important to address violent offenders as well as nonviolent offenders. We have a window with the nonviolent. Let's open that window and guide in. And I was also a homeless drug addict. And I'm now in my third year of law school at the University of Maine School of Law. I'm president of the American Constitution Society for the state of Maine and the Maine Law School. I'm working with the Sentencing Project here in Washington, D.C., and I chair the mayor of Portland, Maine's Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program Subcommittee. And I think that it's people like us that should be leading this movement. And I think that I'm generally very private about my past. And just since I've been down here and just since I've realized that I'm a third-year law student, I'm not a 1L anymore, I'm not applying anymore. And you know what? This is so much bigger than me that it would be a shame for me to keep being quiet about my past. And so I'm standing up here to say that I want to be part of this. I want to be part of this change. And it's just so much bigger than I am. The work we're doing, I love all these meetings. I have lots of opportunities to come to lots of meetings and hear all the people that agree on everything discuss what we agree on. It's wonderful because it facilitates, and then it comes, okay, but what do we do on the ground? So ban the box, lead, diversion programs. So I'm here this summer to work with the Sentencing Project on these national initiatives. And I think it's just as important to have the folks from the communities all over the country brought in. So what we're doing in Portland, Maine is we're attempting to develop a program that diverts low-level offenders at the front end at the time of their arrest, and they do not even enter the criminal justice system. We keep them out of the system from the beginning and instead see what happens. Instead of a jail cell, we offer them treatment, we offer them housing, etc. So I really wanted to thank all of the people here today that are talking about this message of hope and of freedom, and also of concrete steps that we can take on the ground. And everybody's agreeing on the rhetorical level. My question for the panel is how to get people to agree on the policy level, how to make changes on the ground, on the streets, because we can have all the op-eds we want about how this needs to change, and that's great. I'm glad we're having this attention. But how do we convince the district attorney that doesn't want to budge? How do we convince the sheriff who, and there's all the issues about the employment generated from prison. I was in prison in central Pennsylvania. Factory shut down, prison opened up. I lived in that prison, Lewisburg. So, I mean, it's a complex issue, but thank you.
Anybody want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump at that. I think it is absolutely critical that we continue to inspire people like you to step up and lead. That if we don't have that leadership being who is in the decision maker's face, it does not have the soul for it to be something they're going to take up. It just doesn't. I can run around and say it all day. I can talk about all my familial impacts. I can do it. But it requires someone that can really say, this is how the current system impacted me. This is what should have been in place for me, that actually makes decision makers listen. It really sounds simple like that, but it is really just that simple. And that story has got to hit the pavement hard. When we did it in Georgia, it's because Ms. Marilyn Wynn, our leader, she literally drove the entire state. It did not matter where she went, she was going to tell you the same story about her life and what she knew needed to happen. And that's how we move these things. We absolutely have to have the leadership of folks that have experienced it. I know it sounds simple, but it is what we know is working.
Folks, we're out of time. In fact, we're 2 minutes over time. So, thank you.
Thank you. You are
Great couple panels. We are about to wrap. In my remaining 3 minutes, here we go. First, we like to say at the Forum for Community Solutions here at Aspen that we partner with Best in Class, and I think we heard not only from Best in Class national partners, but that they in fact partner with great Best in Class partners on the ground. So really appreciate the level of the conversation, the leadership in this room. It's very powerful and inspiring. Thank you to the Center for Community Change. Thank you to the Vera Institute of Justice. Thank you to my Brothers Keeper Alliance for being our partners in this. Second, it's just interesting to hear the emphasis on reintroducing humanity into this conversation. And I think that's one of the big takeaways for all of us, that this is about human development at the end of the day, and how that gets interrupted, and how so much human potential gets diverted because of mass incarceration. And I won't go further into it, but I do think the point about Dr. King's the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. We just did a meeting in New Orleans last week, and Angela Glover Blackwell added, but there are some times when you need to push on that. And this is that time for this issue. I really believe that. I know we may be still tinkering around the edges, but when the Aspen Institute is doing a panel like this, 2 panels like this, you know that something is different. When the system leader sits next to the right on crime conservative, there is something here, but we got to push on that. And I think there are people here who will help us push on that arc. And last, when we were down in New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, talking about something else, said, you can't go around race on this. You can't. You got to go through it. And I think that's a key takeaway that all of us have to understand, though, regardless of where we sit in our privilege. And if you're sitting in the Aspen Institute right now, you sit in some form of privilege. You cannot go around race. You have to go through it on this one, and I think that's a key takeaway. So we at Aspen want to go through it, go forward with all of you in this work, and we invite all of you who are here to join these organizations, these groups, these national leaders, these place-based leaders, as we move the needle on this huge issue, and ultimately we end mass incarceration in America. Thank you all for coming.